about a race of giants who used to roam America? It sounds wild, right? Well, today we're going to dig into this incredible story. We're talking colossal bones, ancient legends, and even a possible cover-up that goes right to the top of the scientific world.
So, right off the bat, here's the big question. Did a race of giants actually walk this continent? I know, it sounds like something straight out of a fantasy novel, but the threads of this story are actually woven through centuries of real historical records, and that's exactly where we're going to start.
Okay, so to really get to the bottom of this mystery, we're going to follow a fascinating trail of evidence. We'll start with diaries from the first European explorers, then dive into the legends of Native American tribes. After that, we'll look at the actual physical evidence. We're talking giant bones, and even a pretty shocking note from a guy who would go on to become president. And it all leads to this really serious accusation of a massive institutional cover-up.
So, let's kick things off back in the Age of Discovery, when European ships were first making contact with the so-called New World and the people who lived there.
Maybe the most famous early account comes from Ferdinand Magellan's absolutely insane journey to circle the globe. While his crew was stuck for the winter down in what's now Argentina, they ran into a local tribe. A tribe so large that they named the whole region Patagonia, which literally means land of the big-footed.
And you can just feel the shock in the words of the guy who is writing down the official history of the expedition. He describes this person who was on a completely different scale. I mean, so tall that a grown man only came up to his waist. And think about this. This wasn't just some sailor's tall tale. This was an official entry in the ship's log.
And what's really interesting is that this wasn't just a one-off. Look at the pattern here. Over the next few decades, the stories from different expeditions just kept getting more and more extreme. The reported heights went from twice our height to a very specific 7.5 feet, all the way up to an unbelievable 12 feet tall.
And right around the same time, but clear across the continent in Mexico, Hernán Cortés was hearing a very similar story. His Tlaxcalan allies told him that they had conquered a race of giants. And to prove it, they showed him a femur bone that was as tall as a normal man. Cortés was so blown away, he actually had the bone shipped back to the King of Spain as proof. But you see, the explorers, they were only getting the very end of the story. The people who had been living on this land for thousands of years, well, they had their own accounts, histories of a long and very bloody war.
Let's head over to what's now Nevada. The Paiute people there have this incredibly detailed oral history about a war they fought against a fearsome race they called the Sitka. And these weren't just tall people. No, they were described as red-haired, vicious, and often cannibalistic giants who were constantly preying on the Paiute tribes.
So the story goes that things got so bad that all the different Paiute tribes, who didn't always get along, they actually formed an alliance. They decided to wage a war to wipe out the Sitka for good. They eventually cornered the last of them in this huge cave. The giants refused to surrender. So the Paiutes trapped him inside, piled up brush at the entrance, and set a massive fire, suffocating and burning the last of their ancient enemies.
For hundreds of years, this was just a story. A legend. But then, fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, people started digging. And what they found, well, it seemed to back up these ancient tales in a big way. When you start to lay out all these discoveries, a really strange pattern starts to pop up. Look at this. At Lovelock Cave, they find red-haired mummies, some up to 8 feet tall, and then poof, they just vanish from university collections. Then you've got Lompoc, where a 12-foot skeleton is found and quickly reburied. Spirit Cave, ancient mummies are literally seized by the government. Are you seeing the theme here? It seems like every time this extraordinary evidence appears, it just as quickly disappears.
And here's where the legend and the physical evidence seem to click together perfectly. The miners who first dug into Lovelock Cave, they reported something very specific. The rock all around the entrance was blackened and scorched, as if from some massive ancient fire, exactly like the Paiute legend described.
So this trail of vanishing evidence, it leads us to the most controversial, most explosive part of this whole mystery. The accusation that America's most famous scientific institution systematically erased an entire chapter of human history.
Now, before we dive into the cover-up itself, just think about this for a second. In 1848, a young Abraham Lincoln wrote this note after visiting Niagara Falls, and listen to how casually he talks about a species of extinct giants whose bones fill the mounds of America. For him, this wasn't some fringe conspiracy theory, it was just common knowledge.
Which brings us to a huge, glaring question.
If a future president and pretty much everyone else at the time treated giant remains like it was no big deal, then where is all that evidence today? Seriously, where did all the bones go?
Okay, so people who believe in the cover-up theory point to a motive that's all about academic pride. Back in the late 19th century, the Smithsonian was pushing this idea they called isolationism, basically that Native American cultures developed all by themselves, with zero outside influence. The existence of a whole separate race of giants, especially one that some accounts described as looking kind of Caucasian, well, that would have completely destroyed their official story. So, according to the theory, the evidence just had to go away.
And the list of this conveniently vanishing evidence is long and very specific. You've got an 8-foot mummy from San Diego that the Smithsonian buys, only to later call it a hoax and destroy it. A 7.5-foot skeleton from Iowa that supposedly just crumbled to dust as soon as it hit the air. The New York Times reports on huge 9-foot skeletons. And then, crickets, complete silence. The pattern is pretty hard to just brush off.
And just to give you some perspective on that San Diego mummy, the $500 the Smithsonian paid for it back in 1895, that's the equivalent of about $14,000 today. That is a whole lot of money to spend on something you're just going to turn around and call a worthless fake.
So, where does that leave us? Well, we have this really compelling story, pieced together from explorer diaries, Native American legends, and this incredibly frustrating trail of missing bones. Now, it's really important to say that the mainstream scientific view is totally different. They argue these stories probably come from a mix of things: misidentified mammoth or mastodon bones, sensational newspaper articles from a time when hoaxes were common, and just, our natural love of a good story. There is no hard, verifiable proof of giant humanoids in the academic record.